Hi, my name is Bart de Gols and I'm the founder of the innovative sport dog community and the CEO of Tactical Canine Solutions. I want to welcome you to this lecture from teacher to professor, which is the second in our series. In this lecture, we will take a deep dive in the advanced concepts of operant conditioning. We will look at stress and we will look at other factors that influence your dog's learning. This lecture is built upon the knowledge gained in From Tyrant to Teacher lectures. If you haven't watched that video, I invite you to do so. This lecture is not about tricks, tips, and gimmicks and how to train your obedient dog in 10 lessons. This lecture is also not about specific problem behaviors and how to solve them. I'm also not here to give a demonstration of how good my dogs are, nor am I to force you here into a system. These lectures are about behavior. Human behavior, animal behavior, and in specific, dog behavior. In these lectures, we will talk about more advanced concepts of dog training. We'll take a deeper dive into operant conditioning, Skinner's theory, classical conditioning, Pavlov, factors that affect learning, stimuli and control, stress and how that affects learning, and eventually, how to build a conflict-free reward system. We learned that dogs are not wolves. We learned that dogs are a species on its own. However, they come with a lot of similar innate behaviors than their ancestry of the wolf. It all started 33,000 years ago with the domestication process of the wolf that results in the current dog. However, a huge diversification in phenotype, genetically dogs are almost all the same. Hence, a Great Dane could breed with a Yorkshire Terrier. So for all dogs, these similar innate behaviors of the wolves will apply. We also learned that nothing in a dog's life is ever free, and that comes from the wolf's ancestry. Wolves used to hunt for their food in order to survive. And there we have also learned that dogs do things for two reasons: for survival and to always better their situation. We also learned that we trainers, we humans, didn't invent behaviors. As a matter of fact, all animals have innate behaviors and all animals display these behaviors very well. They are born with a knowledge to survive. They are born with a knowledge to socially interact, if we talk about socially interactive species. And we also saw that they're excellent learners. One of the most interesting things for a lot of people is that we as humans think that we need to teach our dog to sit, to down, or to stand, but that all these behaviors are already in the dog. They are innate behaviors. So for us, the more important part is not actually to teach the dog these innate behaviors, the sit, the down, and the stand, but is to learn to communicate. And that is where training the trainer is more important than training the dog. Most people communicate with their voice. We are an audible, inclined species, where dogs, on the other hand, communicate with their body language. And that is where the skill from the human comes in. So we learned that animal behavior and dog training is both a mechanical skill as well as a science. And for some of them, maybe a little bit of an art too. And we've seen that these mechanical skills require some high hand coordination, some peripheral awareness, and that in order to do it right, we will need to have the right attitude, the knowledge, the training, and the knowledge about equipment and some experience with all of that. We have seen that golf is a mechanical skill and heart surgery is a mechanical skill and that dog training is a mechanical skill. And in order to get better at that skill, practice makes perfect. Dog training should be repeatable and should be profitable and should be fun. What's in it for me, says the dog. Why should you do your little silly human tricks? Why I could go wander around and sniff and explore the world and be doggy by myself. What do you do to make it my worthwhile to work with you, Mr. Human? Through classical conditioning, Pavlov and Skinner and operant conditioning, we have learned the foundation how dogs learn. We have learned the use of equipment and we have learned how important body language is. We have also used that some of the equipment, the clicker, is the safest tool for dog training, but on the other hand, we have also learned that what you click is what you get. What that means that clicker training, in order to get very precise behavior, we have learned that our timing should be perfect. And in order to get our timing right, we need to have observational skills and knowledge about the body language that the dog is presenting. We also learned that punishment and applying aversive is not for beginners and weekend warriors, but for seasoned trainers and very expert animal behaviors, as the implementation of aversive can destroy a relationship pretty quickly. We have learned that great leadership is more than just being a dictator. We have learned that leadership is actually being a teacher, being a mom, being a dad, being an uncle, and embody a lot of different roles in that one person. That's why becoming a good leader is so difficult, as we need to embody so many different roles. And communication with a dog never stops. It is a 24/7, 365 days a year process. We have learned that one of the most important things to create is trust, respect, and being fun. And the most difficult thing for us humans to do in our communication is consistency. We've learned that dogs learn really quickly, 1 or 2 weeks, and they know new skills, but we also learned that some humans learn really slow and take about 6 to 8 weeks or sometimes 6 to 8 months in order to get new skills acquired. And some people never learn. Dogs need to work for anything, for everything, for anything that motivates them. That means food, play, social contact, etc. And that's a hard thing for us humans to understand, that a dog actually needs to work for social contact and for food and for play. The other thing that's important is that we always reward that calm mind state, because when the mind is calm, learning can take effect. So we are responsible to setting our dogs up for success to learn this whole human game. If we ask too much from him and we become a lumper and we will raise reward criteria too fast, we often fail. We have also learned that dog training is a very precise process, and I always talk about my 6-foot wall of paper, and we should build it sheet by sheet, not pack by pack or box by box. So animal behavior is a splitting job. I always say, be a splitter, not a lumper. Let's dive into some more advanced concepts of operant conditioning and build up all the knowledge that we learned. Does my behavior control what happens to me? Was a question answered by Thorndike in 1913. Thorndike laid the framework of the stimulus response theory used in behavioral analysis today. Thorndike brought 3 important laws into behaviorism. The first one is the law of effect. If a consequence is pleasant, the preceding behavior is repeated more likely. If a consequence is unpleasant, the preceding behavior is less likely. His law of readiness said that a series of responses could be chained together to satisfy a goal, which, when blocked, would result in a lot of annoyance. The third law, his law of exercise, said that certain responses will be strengthened with practice and weaken when not practiced. So let's have a deeper look into Thorndike's law of effect. The classic example of Thorndike's stimulus and response was Thorndike's puzzle box. And the puzzle box was just a box with a string and a lever in. And when a cat, for instance, would pull the string or push the lever, he would escape. And the more successful the cat was, the faster that behavior was repeated. So let's have a look at Thorndike's puzzle box right now.
But how is a new skill learned? That was a question which began to fascinate Thorndike. To answer it, he built some ingenious puzzle boxes from which cats could only escape by operating latches.
And in you go.
The cat appears to be very clever in engineering its escape, solving the problem with a deftly placed paw and a push of its nose. But Thorndike didn't believe that an animal, even a clever cat, understands the consequences of its behavior. When he placed a cat in the puzzle box for the first time, Thorndike was unable to see any evidence of flashes of insight. The successful actions appeared first by chance. He proved that the apparent cleverness arose by trial and error, and used graphs to measure the rate of learning. A well-practiced cat quickly recalls the actions that help it escape to its reward of food. If an action brings a reward, Thorndike believed that that action becomes stamped into the mind. In his thesis, he explained further his ideas about learning, that behavior changes because of its consequences. He called this his law of effect, which explained how even wild creatures develop new habits.
A real-life example of Thorndike's instrumental learning, the foundation of stimulus, response, and consequence framework, is, for instance, a dog that is locked up in a room. The dog jumps on the door, scratches on the door, and eventually hits the handle, and the door goes open. So in the beginning, the dog will not relate that that was the handle, but after a couple of tries, by being locked in the room all the time, the dog will figure out that, hey, if I jump on that handle, the door will go open. The same with the dog in a wire crate. Some dogs escape to the wire crate by stretching out and pushing the roof high, so the latch, that metal latch that you have on a wire crate, actually unlatches and the dog escapes. So all examples of instrumental learning. If you look at this formula, the S stands for stimuli and the D is discriminative. So discriminative stimuli, and then we have a response. And that response has a consequence. And again, Thorndike's law of effect said that the more pleasant the consequence is of a preceding behavior, the more likely that behavior will appear. The less pleasant the consequence is, the less likely that behavior will continue. In operant conditioning, we have 4 quadrants, and those quadrants are divided into 2 categories. We have a reinforcement side and we have a punishment side. On the reinforcement side, we have positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. Both of these reinforcement sides are to stimulate that a behavior is more likely to occur. On the punishment side, we have the same thing. We have punishment, positive punishment, and negative punishment. The punishment side is there so behaviors are less likely to occur. So let's look at an example. Our child does his homework all the time by itself, and when the homework is finished, we are going to give it an ice cream. That is an example of positive reinforcement. Now we actually tie the child to a chair until his homework is finished, and when his homework is finished, we release the tie and the child is free to do whatever it pleases. Relieving that tie is a form of negative reinforcement. We are going to take a aversive away when the behavior is done and finished and meets our criteria. Then on the punishment side, we have negative punishment. So the child doesn't do his homework, so we are going to take a motivator away. So we could, for instance, take his iPad away for not finishing his homework. On the positive punishment side, we're actually going to apply something, so we could give him a spanking for not doing his homework, and that is an example of positive punishment. Let's take a deeper look into Skinner's operant conditioning. On the left side, we have the reinforcement side. On the right side, we have the punishment side. The reinforcement side, again, is increasing behavior, and the punishment side on the right here is decreasing behavior. In the reinforcement side, we have a positive side and a negative side. The positive side, we're going to add an appetitive stimulus following correct behavior. For instance, the dog sits, we're going to give it a cookie. On the negative side, we have two categories. We have escape and we have active avoidance. The escape is we're going to remove a noxious stimuli following the correct behavior. So here's an example. We're going to put a choke chain on the dog and we're going to choke the dog. When the dog sits and performs the correct sit, we're going to remove the choke, we're going to remove the noxious stimuli, and that is that. Active avoidance is the dog is going to sit to avoid being corrected. A lot of people make a mistake there because they think avoidance training is choking the dog, which is actually escape training. The dog in active avoidance is performing a behavior to avoid a aversive or noxious stimuli. For instance, with this example with the child is studying to avoid getting a bad grade. On the punishment side, again, this is to decrease behavior. We have a positive side, which we're going to add a noxious stimuli following behavior. So for instance, the dog is jumping on the counter and you smack him on the head or you push him away. That is a noxious stimuli. On the negative side, we can remove an appetitive stimulus following good behavior. For instance, the dog is jumping on the counter and you take all his food away from the counter, you put it away, and now the food disappeared. So that's an example of negative punishment. Or in the child, again, we're going to take the iPad away for not doing his homework. So all of the knowledge that we gained from Skinner's operant conditioning started in his laboratory. So when Skinner was a Harvard student, he designed a Skinner box, or a operant conditional chamber as we know it in behavioral analysis. And in that chamber he would put a rat, and that rat would be exposed to certain stimuli. A light that would trigger food, and a electrified floor that would give him a noxious stimulus if he did something wrong, so a punishment. So let's have a look at Skinner's box. Let's analyze the experiment with a rat. So a rat would have a antecedent, a discriminative stimulus, a light that would go on, and the rat would execute a particular behavior. When the rat would execute the behavior of jumping on a lever, food would be presented and the rat would be rewarded. So the rat's behavior has consequences. These consequences are processed by the brain, and in case of a rewarding consequence, that behavior would continue to happen. In case of a noxious consequence, a electric shock on the paws due to the electrified floor, the behavior would stop. These associations are done in the brain and are very similar, like Thorndike's law of effect. The biggest difference between Thorndike and Skinner is that Skinner implemented a secondary reinforcer. In the rat's case, the secondary reinforcer was a light. In Thorndike's puzzle box with the cat, there wasn't a secondary reinforcer. It was just the action, the instruments that the cat was doing that led to the rewards. And that is the difference, the behavioral analysis difference between instrumental learning and operant conditioning, the lack of a secondary reinforcer. When we look at classical conditioning or operant conditioning, we studied Pavlov a little bit in the previous webinar. And so we saw that Pavlov had this experiment, we had a dog and a bell would go off and then food would be presented and eventually the dog would salivate when the bell go off and even food wasn't presented. So that's basically some classical conditioning. But in real life, classical conditioning and operant conditioning are only black and white in very psychological laboratory. You know, the difference here is classical conditioned responses occur even though nothing is required from the animal. The unconditioned stimulus is presented no matter what the animal does. Operant conditioned responses occur because the situation is set up that if the animal performs a desired response, something happens, and if it doesn't, nothing happens, or vice versa, depending on what quadrant is used. And what they mean by that is if he doesn't perform or he performs a response that you don't want, then often a punishment is presented. I'm going to cook you your favorite food. And your favorite food is a lasagna. So I'm cooking this lasagna and I'm going to present this lasagna right in front of you. You haven't eaten for a day and you're really hungry. Your body is going to respond by making your mouth water. You're basically producing saliva. And there's nothing that you needed to do. There's just a Pavlovian response to the smell of that food. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to set a couple of criteria. If you do not eat the lasagna, I'm going to give you $100. However, the behavior that I would like you to see perform is that you actually cut into the lasagna, grab a piece of lasagna on the food, and hold it in front of your mouth. What you can do is actually swallowing it and eating it. If you're not complying with those criteria, I'm going to take the entire lasagna away. If you are complying with it, I am going to give you $100. So here are Pavlovian responses and operant conditioning going hand in hand. If you meet the criteria and not eat the lasagna, I'm going to give you $100, which is an example of what? Right, positive reinforcement. If you're not meeting the criteria and I'm going to take the lasagna away, that is an example of right, negative punishment. Now, if you do eat the lasagna and I'm going to give you a slap on the face, that would be an example of right, positive punishment. Now, if I would choke you until you take the piece of lasagna out of your mouth, that would be what? Yes, an example of negative reinforcement. The formation of associations between stimuli, occurrences, and experiences after only one exposure is called single event learning. Single event learning is often tied to aversives and negative experiences and fear. For example, you go to this restaurant and you have this meal where you suddenly becomes ill. Your body gets this very aversive feeling and you have negative conditioning to that particular restaurant. That negative conditioning is so hard that you will never set foot in that restaurant again. While it actually could be that there was only one raw shrimp or bad piece of chicken in that meal, and that was only one occurrence in that restaurant. But because the aversive effect was so hard on you, you will now stop going to that restaurant. Another example is you bring your dog to the nail salon and the nail gets clipped too short. The dog experiences this very sharp but hard pain and now is in fear for his life from nail clippers and the whole nail trim experience. That is a single learning event. The precise neural mechanisms by which such rapid associations and long-lasting associations are formed have yet to be determined. A vulnerable group to single learning events are pups in their imprinting periods. These pups are normally between 5 and 14, 16 weeks old. These pups are very sensitive to random noises and random events that are not related to anything that can startle them or actually cause a lot of fear. Other dogs are genetically prone to something that we call neophobia. And neophobia, it means new fears. Neo is the Latin name for new, and phobia is the Latin name for fear. With wolves, we see that a lot. Wolves naturally have a neophobia in them. The pups are normally very, very confident, and then suddenly at 18 months the neophobia kicks in and wolves are literally afraid of everything, especially humans. We see that in wolf sanctuaries. Wolf pups are born and the caretakers take the wolves out on harnesses and leashes and walk them around and can actually hand feed them and show them to the public. And then when the wolf turns 18 months to 2 years old, the wolf now suddenly becomes a fear of maybe that person, the harness and the leash. And that is because of neophobia. Some dog breeds are more prone to neophobia than others. I think about the DDR German Shepherd dogs that are naturally more prone to neophobia. We need to be very careful with those type of dogs between the age of 6 weeks and 6 months to a year and a half old on what we do with them. Sometimes we need to be very, very careful to expose them to random noises, as that might actually become aversive for them, and hence they become fearful of something very simple. You're sitting in your living room and you're watching TV. Suddenly you hear this unexpected loud noise and you turn your head. That behavioral response to a altered, novel, or unexpected stimulus is what we call a oriental response. The physiological components of the orienting response have been identified as well, such as dilated pupils, dilated vessels, increased heart rate, and the electrical resistant changes of the skin. This research was done by Ivan Pavlov in 1972. The orienting response seems to be more present in puppies and young adults. Also, they're present in very young children, as young children respond quicker to loud noises or flashlights. Eventually, when we grow older, we habituate to random things around us. So, orienting response and habituation kind of go hand in hand. First, we're surprised by a noise or a flashlight, and quickly we habituate to the situation even though the loud noise keeps presenting itself or the light keeps continuing flashing. So in 1951, Skinner made another big contribution to the behavioral analysis world by his concept of shaping. Shaping is basically gradually or successfully reinforce or punish behaviors that either come close or are far away from the target behavior. What's important with shaping is that we need to have a extreme good picture, a very clear picture of the desired behavior. So the end picture that we would like the animal to do needs to be very clear. So what's going to happen is that we going to reinforce behaviors that come close to that target behavior. And by successively reinforcing behaviors that come closer every time, eventually we will end up with the desired behavior. And that needs to be step by step. Every couple repetitions, what we will do is we will raise our criteria closer to that target behavior and then either reinforce that attempt or punish that attempt, depending on a successful approximation or an approximation that is far of it. Shaping is not only used in animal behavior, but also in psychology and in learning with children. For instance, people that can't speak or hear, they often learn by shaping. So they get rewarded by successful approximations of what they want the child to learn. For instance, when they teach a 3 or 4 year old to put a square box in a form, then the teacher would reward attempts that come very close to that desired behavior. And eventually, the child is going to figure out that he needs to put the box into the form. So shaping is not just the execution or performance of the behavior, it's the entire process of learning. So let's look at an example. We want to learn a headstand. We don't know a headstand, so we sign up for yoga. We get a email from the yoga teacher and his establishment thanking us for signing up. So we feel great. That's the first reinforcement of signing up, receiving the email and us giving us a good feeling. The second time, we are actually showing up for class. The yoga teacher is seeing us and is thanking us for coming to class. What a great thing to hear. We are reinforced again, just for showing up in class. Lesson 2 and lesson 3, we are actually putting our hands on the mat, and the yoga teacher says that we are doing an excellent job. Our techniques are improving. Lesson 4 and 5, we are actually putting the forearms on the mat and stretching legs. Here again, the yoga teacher is perplexed from our flexibility and gives us some kudos, and we feel great again. Yoga is awesome. We are going to go back to class the next week and we're putting our forearms on the mat and our legs are up. What an improvement again of the last week's performance, and the yoga teacher is super happy and we feel great about ourselves. We also feel great about what we have achieved. So again, reinforcing. Lesson number 10 and 12, we are actually doing the headstand and executing the headstands perfectly, just as the teacher had imagined. And that is the process of shaping. So basically, during the entire process, we had successful approximations of that target behavior and we were reinforced and we felt good, and therefore we continued doing these behaviors. When we're doing great stuff, and we want to reward the dog, one of the things that we need to understand are schedules of reinforcement, and schedules of reinforcement are important. Yeah, behaviors are shaped through a process of continuous reinforcement of successive approximations of the target behavior. So continuous reinforcement eventually becomes less reinforcing. There is a need for partial schedules of reinforcement that vary in their ability to maintain learned behaviors as discovered by Skinner. And then there are 4 schedules that we will have a look at. So what does that mean? So in the beginning, what we're going to do is we're going to start rewarding every successive response that is very close to what we want. So the first step that we do is we're going to ask the dog, we're starting hand feeding, yeah. So when we walk backwards, and the first sheet of paper that we want, the first reward criteria that we want is that the dog actually comes to you, and then when the dog comes to you, he gets a reward. And every time he does that, he gets a reward, he gets a reward, he gets a reward, and he always gets the same rewards. It's like, oh, I come to you, I get $1, I get a piece of food, 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 I get a piece of food. Usually, the dog is going to predict, hey, I'm going to get a piece of food, and that piece of food eventually is not going to be as reinforcing, because he's going to be very satiated, with that food, and he says, hey, now I'm not motivated for that one piece of food. However, all training starts with continuous reinforcing, because in the beginning of training, it does create a lot of motivation. We have 2 areas here. We have a ratio side and we have an interval side. The ratio side is basically the amount of responses, and then the interval side is the elapsed time. And both of these categories are either fixed or variable. And so what we are going to do in dog training is we are going to stay often on the ratio side. The first way of reinforcing here, I mentioned it in the beginning here, or a little while ago, is continuous reinforcement. So every response is followed by a reward. So every correct response, boom, gets the reward. You ask for a sit, every sit, boom, gets reinforced. The dog sits, it gets reinforced. So the animal will respond very steady with a moderate rate with unpredictable pauses. And those unpredictable pauses means that, as soon as the animal eats, and every sit gets reinforced, Eventually, he gets full of food, and then he says, "Well, I think I'm going to take a break here." So he grabs his little drink and he checks out, mm, gets a little bit of a drink because the animal gets satiated with the reinforcer. Same with ball. The dog sits, or the dog comes to you, throw the ball, and the dog comes to you, throw the ball, you throw the ball, you throw the ball, you throw the ball, and the dog says, "Yeah, I'm kind of like full of ball chasing, and now I want to go smell something." And then he checks out. Is because we use that continuous reinforcer way too much. So when we go to a fixed ratio, for instance, a fixed ratio of 6, yeah, that means that the animal needs to make 6 correct responses before he gets the reward, and when he makes 12 correct responses, he gets 2 rewards. So what's going to happen is that the animal is going to respond at a high steady rate, except immediately following the reinforcer. Then there's something that we call a post-reinforcement pause, and that post-reinforcement pause is literally immediately after the the reinforcer is given. The behavior required is a down, and the criteria that we have in that down is that the dog's feet need to be perfectly aligned. Yeah, so we worked on a really good down. So we're doing competition downs here, and so we are at the criteria. We set the criteria that the front paws need to be aligned. So in our example of a fixed ratio of 6, the dog needs to perform 6 downs that meet that criteria. If he's got 5 downs, he is not going to get reinforced. So we are going to ask him down. We're going to let him stand up. We're going to make him down. And when he hits 6 perfect downs, according to the criteria that we have set, then he gets the reinforcer. And then what happens after that reinforcer, immediately after he got that reinforcer, you will see that the rate of response will slow down a little bit because he's so busy with that reinforcer. It gives him this like big dopamine spike, and so that needs to ooze out a little bit, and then he's back on track. What is a variable reinforcer? So a variable reinforcer here is the reinforcer is delivered after an average number of correct responses that has occurred. So the number of responses required for each reinforcer varies from one occasion to the next. What matters at the end is the amount of correct responses. So the animal cannot predict how many responses are needed in order to get the reinforcer. So I call that my slot machine effect. What I always say to my students is that's what you need to become. You need to be very predictable and unpredictable almost. So you need to be very predictable in your communication. You need to be very consistent in your communication, but you need to be very variable and unpredictable in how much reward he's going to get. And you need to turn yourself into a slot machine, and that is going to become very addicting. I always tell this joke to my students is we live in the United States. We're a capitalistic country, and we don't live in a communist regime. We like to work and get bonuses and be pleasantly surprised rather than getting the same paycheck every time. So dogs are the same way. So if they would predict that they always get the same reinforcer, eventually their motivation is going to drop out a little bit, and they're going to find something what makes their situation at that particular moment even better and more interesting. For instance, if I would give you, you look into my eyes, I give you $1. You look into my eyes, I give you $1. You look into my eyes, I give you $1. You look into my eyes, I give you $1, and so on and so on. So every time you look into my eyes, you give a buck. After 10 minutes of playing this game, I said, yeah, well, this is boring. But now what I'm going to do is you look into my eyes and I'm going to give you $1. Then you look into my eyes, I'm going to give you $1. Then the third time you look into my eyes, I'll give you $4. The fifth time I don't give you anything. But the sixth time I'm going to give you $100, and the seventh time I'm going to give you $10, and then nothing and nothing and nothing, and then eventually I'm going to give you $150. Now this game becomes a lot more interesting. Many salespeople, they are on this variable reinforcement schedule. Yeah, the reinforcer occurs after a fixed amount of time. So what is a fixed interval reinforcement schedule? Yeah, short FIRS. The reinforcer occurs after a fixed amount of time is passed and is independent of the amount of correct responses that occurred in that time. The reinforcer is dependent on the amount of time that passes. So the animal doesn't have a lot of incentive to show a lot of correct responses, as he will get the reinforcer anyway. So, my friends, one of the most misunderstood reinforcement schedules. A lot of people think that a fixed interval reinforcement schedule is rewarding the dog for duration, which is not the case. This is absolutely not the case. So you see that a lot of that misconception on dog training forums, etc., etc. These people have really no idea what fixed interval reinforcement schedules in animal behavior and behavior analysis actually mean. So what it does mean is that I have set a 30-second interval, fixed interval reinforcement schedule in my training block from 3 minutes. Yeah. So what is going to happen that after 30 seconds has passed, the animal is going to get his reinforcer. So the criteria might be a sit. Yeah. So 5 seconds the dog sits, the dog doesn't get anything. After 10 seconds the dog downs, the dog doesn't get anything. After 20 seconds the dog sits again. Well, he doesn't get anything because we set a fixed interval of 30 seconds. And then at second 25 he downs again. He doesn't get anything. And then at second number 30 he stands instead of sits. However, he gets reinforced because we are on that fixed interval schedule. So this is basically just a laboratory way of reinforcing. You will never use that in dog training because no matter what response the dog gives, as soon as he hits that interval mark, that reinforcer is going to come. So not really handy in dog training. Let's look at a variable interval reinforcement schedule. The responses are reinforced after a variable amount of time has passed. So let's look at this example quickly. A motorbike salesman, his supervisor is randomly showing up without notice to give him a bonus. As long as the supervisor sees him actively talking to a customer, he'll give him that bonus. The salesman never knows when the supervisor is going to drop by. He has to continuously engage with the customer in order to increase the chance that his supervisor will notice. The difference here is that he could have sold one bike or 100 bikes on average that month. But all that matters is in order to receive the bonus, he needs to actively engage in a sale with a customer when his supervisor happens to come by. A variable interval reinforcement schedule does have a positive effect on his engagement towards you. So now let's look at innate versus learned behaviors. Innate behavior is a behavior that's performed correctly the first time an animal performs it in a response to a stimuli. It's something that they innately possess, also called instinct. That's where I always say dogs are dogs and cows are cows and horses are horses. And if they make a random or for you random response to a stimuli, if they hear a stimuli, that response is always correct. If that is their instinct talking and their innate behavior talking, then that response is always correct. For instance, the first time your pup hears fireworks or gunfire and his innate behavior is dig a hole and go lay in it, well, that's a correct response. If his response is biting the snot out of you, well, that is a correct response because biting is an innate behavior. If his behavior is like running away and jumping over the fence and get the hell out of there, that flight behavior is a correct response because it's innate. So that's why we need to give the dog guidance so we don't have innate behaviors taking over when certain stimuli are present. So what are these learned behaviors then? So learned behaviors are behaviors learned through experience. It's very plain and simple. Learned behaviors can be adopted in the wild. For instance, a wolf does not have or possess the innate behavior of opening a farm gate. He doesn't, because there's literally not much farm gates in the wild. But now the wolf, has learned that when he lifts his paws up and presses down, on that thing, that the latch that is in front of the gate actually opens, and then he can go to the chickens or the livestock or whatever it is. Through that experience, he gets what he wants, and that is learned behavior. The wolf did not come with the opening gate capabilities from the moment he was born. He actually learned that through experience. The same thing, wolves that go through a culvert in order to cross a road. Now we have these wildlife tunnels. Going through that dark pipe is not an innate behavior that is learned through experience. That, hey, eventually when I go there, there's other food sources or water or whatever the motivator can be. Everything that we teach the dog are also learned behaviors. In innate behaviors, we have two categories. We have simple and complex innate behaviors. The simple ones are reflexes, for instance, blinking. Then another is our knee. When the doctor hits you with a hammer on the knee and your knee goes away, if you touch the hot stove and you pull your hand away, those are reflexes. That is innate behavior. Taxis is a purposeful movement away or towards a stimuli. We all switch the light on in the dark when we sit on the patio, and then out of the blue, all the bugs, all the mosquitoes are all coming to that light. That is a form of taxis, and it's a very purposeful movement. Then on the other hand, we have kinesis. Kinesis is a random movement triggered by a stimuli. For instance, what we can do is you're in the basement and the basement is full of rats. You throw a bucket there or a brick, and then the rats scatter all over the place. That is an example of kinesis. So complex things, we have fixed action patterns. The flying of birds, the mating dance of birds, mating behavior of monkeys. That is a form of a complex innate behavior. A innate behavior for us, for instance, is walking. Plain and simple walking, running, jumping. Walking is a fixed action pattern, and everybody walks very uniquely. I always make this joke, there's a group of people in our society that walk with their pants almost at their knees, so they carry their crotch on their knee. So when you see those people walk, that is a different fixed action pattern than when you see somebody walk in a suit with a suitcase. A businessman, he probably has a different walk than, some of those ghettoish looking people with their pants on their knees, but both represent a fixed action pattern. Migration of birds. Yeah, migration of birds is another one. Migration of birds, very complex behavior, however, it's innate. The Canadian geese, they didn't go to migration school. They just were born. They came with that behavior. They came with that instinct. And as soon as they are able to fly, When winter comes, they're gone, they're heading south and going to warmer areas. It's not something that the bird needed to learn. It came with him. One of the most complex ones is our circadian rhythm, basically our biological clock. When the sun gets up and we don't have blinds, suddenly we're awake. Yeah, so the rooster, for instance, with his sleep-wake cycle, that is a form of innate behavior. The rooster did not go to alarm clock school. The rooster just was born with the ability of making noise when the sun comes up, so all the hens could start feeding and etc. etc. And then some of the birds, like the songbirds, as soon as the sun hits, they begin to sing. That's their trigger. And us waking up is a form of innate behavior, circadian rhythm. Learned behaviors. When we look at learned behaviors, one of the biggest learned behavior is habituation. Habituation is basically habituating to something. For instance, gunfire. I hear gunfire all the time. We're at the range, and then eventually we are habituating ourselves to that gunfire. The range master maybe not even hear as many gunshots as somebody who just went to the gun range for the first time. So he's learned that to deal with that. Pavlovian responses, classical conditioning, that is a form of learned behavior. And then, of course, operant conditioning, what we just discussed, that is a big example of learned behaviors. Insight learning and then single event learning are also two examples of that learned behaviors. Let's dive a little bit deeper in some of that habituation and sensitization. Sensitization and habituation are basically each other opposites. Habituation, that process is used to decrease the response or to end a response to a stimuli. So, and then sensitization is to increase the intensity of the response to a stimuli. So, for example, the doorbell and the random visitor. So at first your dog might be startled the first time the doorbell goes, and a visitor comes in, but you do that over and over and over, and eventually the dog says, well, every time the doorbell goes, somebody comes in and I don't get anything. So now the dog, don't pay attention to the doorbell. You have other dogs that sensitizes themselves to the doorbell because now they said, hey, that doorbell, every time somebody comes in and I don't get any response, they get actually anxious or they get aggressive or they display, whatever the behavior they're going to display. They are actually sensitized to that particular stimuli, and it's very, it's very hard to predict what your dog is going to do. Is he going to habituate to a situation, or is he going to sensitize himself to habituation? That is going to depend on the antecedents of the animal. And one of these antecedents is genetic makeup and is previous conditioning, especially when you rescued or adopted another dog. It's going to depend on the antecedents of the breeder, what experiences did he have there. It's going to depend on the antecedents in the litter, etc., etc. In general, but not always the truth, intense repeated stimuli, the dog will sensitize himself to that. And an example is a neighbor, for instance, who fires his firearms next to you. Every time that gunshot is heard, over the years and over the months, the dog will actually intensify its response. His bark might get louder. He might start, running circles in the yard. Whatever he does, that is the dog sensitizing himself to that gunfire. The way I use sensitization in my courses is my protection whip. Every time the dog hears the whip, there's a lot of energy going on, there's a lot of movement, and so the dog is going to be sensitized to that noise of the whip. And you can see it here, or witness it here every time, I even if I would clatter with my whip or crack my whip on the end of my training field, all my kennels will bark and the entire parking lot will bark because the dogs here, the protection dogs, are very sensitized to that sound of the stick. So with harnesses, that happens the same way. So when you do your agitation harness, the dog is getting conditioned that that particular harness means that they're going to bite something or that they can go high and drive, that they can start barking. And so they are sensitizing themselves to that particular stimuli. In that case, in this example, that stimuli is not intense because it's just it's a visual stimuli and a tactile stimuli because the dog can see the harness and he can feel the harness, but it's not an intense stimuli. However, the dog sensitizes to that stimuli if, responses are always intense to that stimuli, and that is, for instance, protection training. So what is adaptation? So adaptation is not the same thing as habituation, as it does not involve learning. In habituation, the dog learns. Adaptation is a physical process called tiring, and where the sensory neurons stop working. If you have a camera and you have a flashlight, yeah, anybody with like an old-fashioned flash gun, you could do a little test. You could grab that flashlight and then flash that in your eyes, in your face, and what's going to happen is your neurons are going to stop working, and you are going to be blinded. And you didn't need to go to how to get blinded school. Your eyes did not need any lectures on how to do that. Your body just knew it. Yeah, that is called adaptation. Body's response to the cold, body's response to the heat. If you keep, hitting yourself, like fighters, eventually the body is going to form callus. Carpenters with callus in their on their hands. It's not something that they needed to learn. The body knew how to do it, and it adapted himself to that situation. What is learned irrelevance? It's similar but not the same as habituation. Learned irrelevance does not have spontaneous recovery. Habituation does, and I will explain spontaneous recovery here in a little bit. Learned irrelevance, very dangerous, guys. So you're at the dog park and you want to train your doggy to sit. So you're at the dog park and you're doing sit training next to the dog park. In that dog park, however, a lot of owners are calling their dogs all the time. Here, 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 and then eventually you want to do the recall, and so you're going to use here, but the dog has heard here so much that he's completely tuned out that cue and he thinks it's irrelevant. So eventually that is learned irrelevance. The other thing, example that I always use is learned irrelevance to the human voice. So in the beginning, what people do a lot is they talk to their dogs. Where if you go back to the From Tyrant to Teacher seminar, what we have learned is that there's a difference in the way we communicate. Dogs communicate tactile, yeah, by scent, visual, and audible, where we communicate audible, visual, tactile, and then by scent. So that communication does not work. So when we're with the doggies and we do a lot of baby talk with our puppies, what the puppy is learning is that audible communication that comes out of your mouth does not mean anything. There's no response, there's no consequence, it is just irrelevant. And a dog is going to start tuning out your voice. So that voice is important for us because in the future we need to get audible commands to that. But if we have already learned irrelevance, from the dog's perspective, it's going to be very, very hard. The other thing is, for instance, your telephone. When your telephone rings, your mobile phone, I bet you none of your dogs respond to the ringing of your telephone. The dog has learned that that particular ring doesn't mean anything. Nothing happens, there's no response. That is another form of learned irrelevance. Bandura was a professor and scientist, psychologist in behavior, and he studied aggression. Here he is. This is Bandura. What Bandura did is he wanted to see if when people saw violence, if they would respond to that and copy that behavior. He was one of the first guys who studied violence from television. So if we see violence on television, would the guy copy that violent behavior?
Preschool children observed an adult model beat up an inflated Boba doll in novel ways. She pummeled it with a mallet, flung it in the air, kicked it repeatedly, and threw it down and beat it. And these novel acts were embellished with hostile remarks. The children were then left in the playroom that had a variety of toys. Now, the children who had observed the aggressive modeling adopted much of it. They even invented new ways for attacking the doll. Children who had not observed the adult model were less aggressive and never hit the Boba doll in the novel ways that were modeled. The children who had been exposed to the aggressive modeling showed an increased attraction to guns, even though the adult model never used them. At the time we did this research, it was widely believed that seeing others venting aggression would drain away the viewer's aggressive drive. As you can see, exposure to modeled aggression is hardly cathartic. Televised violence has four major effects. It teaches aggressive styles of behavior, weakens restraints over aggression, desensitizes and habituates viewers to human cruelty, and shapes viewers' images of reality. With the enormous advances in the technology of communication, observational learning from the symbolic environment is placing an increasingly powerful role in people's everyday lives. Human attitudes, values, styles of behavior are now being modeled worldwide. As a result, televised modeling is becoming an influential vehicle for political and social change. We now have global broadcasts of societal conflicts as they are happening.
So Bandura gave that start of observational learning, and observational learning is a very powerful tool in dog training. The observational learning is all based on Bandura's social cognitive theory, and what he said, hey, if I have the attention and the attention span to pay attention enough to the things I'll like, if I remember the behavior that was demonstrated, if I have the ability to imitate that behavior or response, and if I am motivated to do that behavior, then that behavior will, be replicated. So if I see a person, making a cabinet, and I'm observing, I say, I have the attention span to look at that person building a cabinet. Okay, I think I remember every step that he did in making that cabinet. I have the ability to, take a screwdriver and give the same responses. And I really want to build a cabinet. I will be able to build that cabinet. If another dog sees another dog, through the fence, he's that looks like hole digging in trees. And hang on, he's not just digging holes; he's biting the roots out of the trees. Oh, I see what he's doing. I have the memory to remember what he's doing, and I'm surely motivated to try that in my own yard. And hence, the dog only sees it a couple times and now starts copying behavior. So, behavior that he's never seen before, now he starts copying that. And so, hence, I don't like dog parks because in dog parks, there's a lot of behaviors out there that you don't want your doggy to know, that through observational learning the dog could know. Another very important aspect are the biological constraints on learning. Animals are biologically prepared to learn different kinds of things, of associations, and different kinds of associations with different degree of difficulty. So it's much easier for an animal to learn new things, new associations close to their very natural world than associations that are not. So a wolf is going to learn hunting from his parents much easier and is going to learn that mud makes me slip and all that stuff than laminate in the house. You bring the dog in the laminate, and it's going to be much more difficult for the dog to memorize that particular unnatural thing than unnatural association than a natural association. An example that I put in here is taste aversion. For instance, you have an egg and the egg is rotten and you get sick, and that stimuli of rotten eggs made you now avoid eggs. You ever had bad food? This smells fishy. The reason why people say that, hey, this smells fishy, is because when they ate something fishy, they probably had a gut ache, they didn't feel well, etc., etc. So that these are biological constraints there on that learning, and we also learn that bad food can make us sick, and then we associate a certain smell to it or taste to it. Factors that affect learning. And one of the factors here is deprivation. Hungry dogs will work for food, rested dogs will work for play, isolated dogs will work for social interaction. If you deprive your dog from playing, and he really likes playing, he's going to work a lot harder to get that play. If your dog really likes food, and you have deprived him from food because he wasn't engaging well, if you don't feed him for a day, the next day he's going to pay a lot more attention if he really likes food. If your dog loves social contact, however, that these deprivation techniques only work when you implement them consistently, and most handlers don't comply. If I, in the beginning stages, of my system, I say, hey, all food comes from hands and comes from the dog making the choice to come to you. Most people, if I say, hey, don't feed him for a day, they will not comply because they feel bad that their doggy didn't got food for one day. Yeah. Well, here it is. If the dog doesn't engage for a day, well, he doesn't get fed for a day. If the dog doesn't eat or doesn't engage the second day, well, on day three, he's going to be extremely hungry. I have never met a dog in my life that wouldn't eat after 2 days of depriving food. These dogs all eat, and the reason why is because They need to do their things to survive, and they want to make their situation better. How can they make their situation better? Is to pay by paying attention to you. They get access to food. And then with games the same way. Oh, okay, yeah, my dog needs a game because otherwise he's bored. Well, if that game is only accessible through work and he doesn't work, then yeah, there's nothing. Deprivation increases the intensity to the deprived motivator. That's basically what we need to remember. Is, if we deprive him from food, he's going to work harder for food. If we deprive him from social contact, when put him in a crate or in a kennel and he doesn't see people, he really is going to work for social contact. The thing with using deprivation in your dog training is you need to use it with strategy, and you need to be skilled in using it. For instance, if you deprive your dog from water, oh, I'm going to let him work for water. If you deprive him from water for 3 days, you end up with a dead dog. You end up in jail because I'll call the animal control. The reason why I say that is that because I see a lot of stupid things around me, and on the internet that people have done and used deprivation, where I said, oh my God, what are you doing? So it's a very useful tool, but again, use it with strategy, and if you use it, be consistent in it. Reward choice is another thing that is very important that affects learning. So in general, the tastier the food, the better the dog will work for it. The more salient the food, the better the dog will work for it. So the amount of food and the quality of food will really affect how the dog learns. In general, smaller bits of food, multiple smaller bits of food will actually work a lot better than one big chunk of food. I want you to look at this example. We're going to give a kid his birthday present and we're going to give him $100. So the kid doesn't have any monetary experience or doesn't value that $100 as we would do the $100. So we give that one piece of $100 and the kid says, oh wow, thank you, I got a gift. So now let's give that same $100 value in 100 $1 bills. So the entire experience of receiving gifts is a lot longer, and the kid will experience that experience more intensely. And hence, he's going to believe that he got a lot more rewards because now he's got 100 rather than one. And with the dogs, that is the same thing. I want you to think about a slot machine in Vegas. People are really addicted to playing slot machines. And the reason why is we can't predict how much reward is going to come out of that machine when we do the good behavior of pulling on the lever, and then hopefully when all the dots line up and we meet that reward criteria, we are going to get rewarded. And sometimes it's $1 and sometimes it's $1,000. The way the slot machine works, however, is it's not going to project a $100 bill or a $1,000 bill if that would exist. No, what it's going to do is going to give this huge amount of quarters. And that is what is addicting. So basically, we want to do that same thing with the dogs. We want to turn ourselves into a slot machine. We want to give the dog the experience that the child has with receiving $101 bills. So food selection, size selection are huge factors that will influence the learning process of the dog. So what we want to vary is the frequency of the reward, the intensity of the reward, the value of the reward. So we want to kind of randomize that. Another thing that we can use is something that's called positive and negative behavioral contrast. And we can either increase performance or decrease performance. And that's all got to do with anticipation. So if you always train with tri-tip, you trained always with tri-tip, that's what you do. Your dog eats tri-tip, he's very spoiled, and I had clients here that trained on tri-tip and vanilla ice cream, believe it or not. So you train on tri-tip, and then you're going to switch over to kibble. That is what we call a negative behavioral contrast. The dog's going to be like, what? No, cool. Yeah, and so he's going to decrease his performance. If he's trained on kibble, and then out of the blue you give him a hot dog or a piece of cheese, or you go to then a piece of tri-tip, the dog's going to be like pleasantly surprised, and now he's going to give you positive behavioral contrast. He's actually going to perform a little bit better. So that positive behavioral contrast and negative behavioral contrast, we need to be aware of that. We also need to be aware of the expectation that my dog has with me. So, for instance, your dog expects to play with a ball, and so that's his expectation. So all your pre-cues, the antecedents and stimuli, led him to believe that you are going to play with a ball, and then you bring out food. Well, for him, that's a negative contrast because you didn't fulfill the expectation. And so his performance in that session could be less. On the other side, if he expects food, so all your antecedent behavior led him to believe that we're going to work for food, but then you take out a ball, he might be motivated for a ball, but if he was more motivated for food, you will see a decrease in performance. That's often a mistake made, with people, that they kind of misjudged what the motivator of that dog is in that particular session or that particular day. So knowing that and being aware of that is important.
So another great tool we have in our tool bag is jackpotting. And jackpotting is these extra good rewards, that piece of steak, that chicken, that tri-tip, that extra smelly cheese that we want to use in our training. We can't use that extra good food as a non-contingent reward for motivation because that will bite us in the foot. If we start using food, extra good food, to try to get our distracting dog to pay attention to us, eventually the dog is going to say, hey, if you don't have that extra good food, I am not going to engage with you. So we need to use that jackpotting, we need to use that extra good food as a reward for excellence in performance. And what does that mean? What is excellence in performance? Well, for instance, we are teaching the dog a down, and what we would like is a speedier down. We would like a faster down. So we use our regular rewards, our regular food that we use, maybe some regular treat sausage or a kibble, and we reward the dog when he meets the criteria of a down. And now the dog, out of the blue, slams a super fast down. Well, that's where the excellence of performance reward or the jackpot would come in handy, and we're going to give him that great piece of food. The dog is going to figure out then the faster he downs, the better his reward is going to be. And then slowly but surely, we can use that fast down as the new criteria just to get his regular reward, and he needs to do something better in order to get that jackpot. And that might be the alignment of his feet, that might be the new criteria, that might be the new excellence in performance. So again, don't use that extra food as that non-contingent reward for motivation, because again, the dog will not be motivated to work for his regular food if you keep feeding him and basically bribing him to come to you because you have that extra steak. Another great tool in our tool bag that goes hand in hand with jackpotting is reward sampling. And I use reward sampling and jackpotting all the time together. And reward sampling is basically, think about this, your child needs to do his homework and is not really motivated. So what we'll do is we have this beautiful cake with cherries and it's super sweet, and we're going to give a tiny little piece of that cake to our kid that needs to be motivated to do his homework. We're not going to give him the whole cake, we're just going to give him that tiny little piece, and what we say, if you have finished your homework, you can have a huge piece of that cake. So reward sampling is to energize and motivate the dog. And you can do that with food, but you can also do that with a toy or a bite wedge. I often use a little tug on the ball or 1 or 2 throws with the ball to tease the dog and say, hey, today we are going to play an awesome game. So I'm sampling that game, I'm sampling the rewards just to energize and motivate my dog. What I would do when I was competing, I would get my dog out of the car, and at the back of the car, I would play a little bit of tug of war and then put him away. And then basically, that was my sample that was available after he did his work. And his work was, of course, competing and running the routine in obedience. And then my dog knew that his ball was at the back of the car and he would get an awesome tug of war. So in my training, I use a combination of reward sampling and jackpotting. So whether I use food, whether I use a ball, whether I use the ball in my 2-ball game or just playing a good tug of war, I always sample a little bit of what he is going to get as his reward. My jackpotting, however, I will never use to motivate my dog to do something extra. I'm not using that as a non-contingent reward. There's always that excellence of performance criteria that he needs to do in order to get that super extra special reward. So hand in hand, jackpotting and reward sampling are very powerful tools to enhance the performance in our training.
Most important influencer and of learning is timing. I say that all the time, guys. Timing is everything. With a clicker, what you click is what you get. You want to click for a head tilt with the eyes up, but on the moment you click, the dog just closed his eyes. That's what you clicked for. You clicked for closing the eyes and not for the head tilt and looking at you. Head tilt, open eyes, click, but head tilt, open eyes, and you close it and click. You just clicked for that. Working on timing is incredibly important. I developed games, my Bart game, my behavioral analysis research training. I use a lot of games to train my handlers to get their timing on behavior better. I always say excellent trainers have excellent timing and amateur trainers have amateur timing or poor timing. A tenth of a second in that timing can make a whole world of difference, in both the reinforcing and punishing quadrants. Hence, we need to be so careful in walking on a leash and having that leash pressure, because the moment that we give that dog a pop, he could have already changed behavior and we pop him for something else, and he is going to completely lose the trust in you, in your way of communicating, because you are so inconsistent in your either reward deliveries or your punishing deliveries. So hence I say the punishment side is for expert trainers only, not for weekend warriors or amateurs. A mistake that a lot of people make is not to condition their second reinforcer strong enough. Yeah. So for instance, the first thing that we do is we're going to condition the dog that click means food, click means food, click means food. The way we can test it, if we click and we get this like, oh my God response, we know that that reinforcer, that secondary reinforcer is conditioned strong enough. With the balls, go look at the video of my 2-ball game where I show you how to condition the different cues for the ball game. If that ball game is not conditioned enough, don't use that game or 2-ball game in your learning, in your training, because you're going to shoot yourself in the foot and the dog doesn't really understand what a secondary reinforcer or that reward at that particular moment means. So be very careful with that. Make sure that every secondary reinforcer is conditioned, and it needs to be conditioned. It really needs to be conditioned before you use it in your learning process. Do not use a secondary reinforcer that is half-assed conditioned, because you will get into troubles later. what are stimuli? We have different kinds of stimuli. We have internal stimuli, for instance, homeostatic imbalances and blood pressure. Those are stimuli that comes from in the body. And we have external stimuli like touch and pain. We have central nervous system stimuli. We have occipital stimuli. There's visual stimuli that goes through the occipital lobe and the primary visual cortex. We have smell, which is olfactory organs. We have taste, which is the tongue, the taste buds. We have sound, which is our tympanic membrane or eardrum, and the cranial nerve, the eighth cranial nerve to be precise, the temporal lobe of the central nervous system, and the primary auditory cortex in the brain. And then we have the cochlea and the cranial nerve 8 also that manages our equilibrium. So a lot of stimuli available for us, and it is through those stimuli, that the dogs, perceive stimulus. They either hear it, feel it, smell it, or don't feel good inside. So this is a very high level explanation of stimuli. So what does that mean in real life? Basically, there's a order in how important stimuli are for the dog. The most important and sensitive stimulus is touch. It's tactile stimuli. So when the dog feels something on his body, for instance, another dog bites him, another dog licks him, or he runs into a tree, that is a very obvious way of communicating. I feel something, I'm going to look away. The second most important version of stimuli is smell. When the dog smells a really salient smell, for instance, a male that smells a bitch in heat, and he can smell that from miles away, believe me, that is a very strong stimulus. The third most important is the little bunny that sticks his head up out of the field, or the squirrel that runs by, or a herd of elk or a herd of deer that run by, and the dog sees it because it's a very salient visual stimuli because it involves movement. And then the last important or last sensitive stimuli on the order is sound. The audible stimuli are less important for the dog. But when the dog hears a very loud sound, for instance, a gunshot or fireworks or a thunderstorm or the car, then he will respond to that. And car noise, for instance, if that audible stimuli is conditioned, if that audible stimuli is conditioned to something pleasant, for instance, he hears the car rolling up the driveway, and the car sound and the engine sound predicts that you are going to come home and you're going to pet them. Therefore, that audible stimuli might actually be more salient and more important than the food bowl that's on the ground and the food that is smelling. He can smell the food, he can see the food, but the audible stimuli of your car coming is more important for him. So hence, it's very important that when we start training, when we start building engagement, that we control the environment and that we set our dogs up for success. And setting our dogs up for success is controlling that stimuli, is controlling that environment. It would be very unwise for me to go and train in a dog park where I have no control over the people, where I have no control over the other dogs, where other people and other dogs are playing with balls. There's a rapid movement where maybe people train with cooked liver, which is a very salient food, and where there's a lot of noise around us. People are using different commands. If I would start there, that would mean that I'm going to have a lot of challenges because of all the other stimuli. So setting your training environment up where you have control over all those stimuli is key to success. And a lot of people go too fast. They're basically lumping. They go from one little area, they train in their kitchen, and there's hardly any stimulus or stimuli there except them. They're moving and they're talking. And then they go out in the park, or they go out in the parking lot from their favorite grocery store, and then the dog is surrounded by multiple stimuli. So lesson learned here, there is a order of importance of stimuli. So again, tactile, touch, perceives over a smell. When the dog smells something, but then something touches him, he's going to respond to that touch. When the dog sees something, but then he smells something on the other side, maybe a bitch in heat, that peat there, he's going to divert, his attention to what he smells. And then when he hears something, oh, hey, I think my dad's talking, but then in his peripheral vision, there's a herd of elk running by, he's going to divert his attention and go to the visual cue. So that's kind of the order of stimuli, and our job is to control them. Stimulus control is a important part of animal training. It's a fundamental part of animal training. However, extremely difficult. Extremely difficult. So here's Thorndike law of effect again. So a discriminative stimulus has a response, and then we will have another stimulus that is either a positive consequence or a aversive or a negative consequence, a very apathive or aversive. And animals learn what behavior to do first and when to do it. First, we're going to teach the animal what behavior to do. And then and only then, when he absolutely understands what behavior it is he needs to do, then we're going to teach him when to do it. Yeah, but first we need to create behavior and have, I would say, partially fluent behavior, and then we're going to teach him to do it. Then we're going to start the process of discrimination. We're going to tell him that, hey, this particular stimuli means you need to sit, that particular stimuli means you need to down, and then I'm going to teach him that no matter in what context you are, whether you're in my kitchen, my living room, my dining room, with the neighbors, at a football field, we are going to generalize that behavior, and we are going to teach the dog that he needs to display that behavior everywhere. Yeah. So discrimination and generalization are two very contradictory processes. Discrimination is when an animal learns to make a particular response to some stimuli, sometimes more than one, but not to others. A example is the dog needs to respond to the visual cue of sit and to the audible cue of sit, but not to slamming the door. He doesn't need to sit, or to other stimuli present. So he says, hey, these two stimuli means that I need to perform a sit or a down. So that discrimination has an adaptive value because it's very important to respond differently to different stimuli. Yeah, you wouldn't want your dog to respond to a loud sounds in all the same way. So if he generalizes all loud sounds means I pee in my house, that would not be good. So that discrimination is a very important phase in his learning. Generalization is a tendency for a stimulus, similar to the conditioned stimulus, to elicit kind of a similar response that is similar to the conditioned response. The idea here is to take away is usually the more similar a new stimulus is to the original conditioned stimulus, the greater the conditioned response will be. If I say sit, pit, frit, kit, put, it all looks the same, so the dog will generalize all these stimuli and have that same response at sit, where sit and down is something completely different, and so here we have a better chance of discriminating that stimuli. When it comes to audible stimuli, guys, what is important is that your audible stimuli, the tonation of your stimuli, the vocabulary of your stimuli, and the energy of the words are unique. For instance, I will give you an example of my sit down and stand stimuli. Off means down. Off, very short, direct. Yeah. Recht staan, it's a very long word and kind of singy. And then zit, zit is very high and short. So that way, if I use those audible stimuli, I give a lot of clarity to the dog, and it's much easier for him to discriminate what behavioral response he needs to give to what stimuli. So that's why I do that. So let's look at this chart here, stimulus control. This is my generalization gradient. So I want you to look at the three colors here. If the gradient is blue and very wide, that means the stimuli are very similar, and so the conditioned response is going to be very similar as well. When it's flat, then we have a problem because he's responding to everything the same way. And what is narrow is we have a very small, similar sounding stimuli, which we are going to have a very small, similar conditioned response. And so we need to work to the green. We want to narrow our stimuli and make them as unique and clear as possible. So this graph is extremely important, to know. Extinction. Let's have a look at an extinction here. So extinction is when a conditioned stimulus is repeatedly presented without the unconditioned stimulus. And so eventually the conditioned stimulus is no longer able to elicit the conditioned response. Process of extinction is used to treat anxieties and phobias. A good example is the opening of your refrigerator door and the cracking sound of the rubber seal. So the dog sees the refrigerator goes open and he hears the seal crack, and that means that, oh my god, food is coming, because maybe in the past you have fed him out of the fridge. Every time you opened the fridge, you gave him a little snack, and so the conditioned response for him is running to the fridge and sitting in front of the fridge every time that fridge door goes open, because his unconditioned stimulus, food, was given. So how can we extinct that behavior? Is by every time you open the fridge is to do what? Nothing. Don't feed the dog, ignore him, and eventually, if you do that long enough, eventually he's going to say, oh my god, this refrigerator doesn't really mean anything anymore. And then eventually what's happening is, out of the blue, so you've done it for 2 years, and in 2 years he's never ever walked up to the refrigerator, and then out of the blue, there he is again. It's something that we call, in behavioral analysis or in animal behavior, spontaneous recovery. So after extinction, the spontaneous occurrence of the previous conditioned response occurs. It doesn't persist, it's only for a small amount of time and it's less intense. But with extinction, we have spontaneous recovery. I see that a lot in my dog aggressive cases, so with aggressive dogs, sometimes towards people and the handler, we counter conditioned and the dog doesn't show that aggressive behavior, but then out of the blue, for a split second, he showed his teeth, his growled, and he showed a mild version of that previous conditioned behavior, and that is what we call spontaneous recovery. With all counter conditioning, that is what happens there. I've never met anybody. I mean, it's impossible. So you always have some form of spontaneous recovery risk when you deal with counter conditioning. Same with phobias, the way they treat people for being afraid of heights. Eventually, they're fine, but then out of the blue, they were fine on the Eiffel Tower, and then they cross a little river with a grate or a metal grate with the holes in that they can see through, and out of the blue, they freak out. That is also an example of spontaneous recovery. Salience and overshadowing. In general, the more salient a stimuli, the quicker the dog will respond to it and the more intense the dog will respond to it. Like we mentioned before, the dog's communication system is different than that from a human. The dogs respond quicker to tactile stimulation, and then smell, then visual stimulation, and then audible stimulation. So with that knowledge, the more salient a stimuli is, again, the quicker the dog will respond to it. So if I have kibble and cooked liver, what do you think the dog will respond to quicker? Probably the cooked liver. And the reason why is that is a more salient stimuli. There is more smell coming from that cooked liver. If I whisper a audible cue or I shout a audible cue, the dog will probably respond quicker and more intense to the loud cue. And that is also for visual. If I just stand there, or I move around, or I stand there and there's a squirrel jumping over my field, the dog will probably look at that squirrel a lot faster than he would look at me because there's movement involved, and a dog's eyesight is sharper when there's movement involved anyway. So what can we learn from this and how can we use that? For instance, if we're putting ourselves on the training field, and we have a high distracting environment because we have spectators and people are moving, but that is the only way that we can train, then probably getting a more salient treat is a better idea because smell is going to overrule the visual distraction. When I'm in a loud environment, then moving around with a ball and having a movement as a reward, like playing tug of or throwing the ball, is probably a good idea. Another good example is a dog is smelling some pee and he does not hear or see you. You can jump behind him, you can run around him, but his nose is dug into the ground and he doesn't see you. From the moment you touch him, he's going to say, hey, who is here? Hey, it's you. And the reason why is that stimuli is again more salient than the smell. The same thing here, he hears something, but in the corner of his eye, he sees a squirrel or a herd of elk running by and is going to pay attention to the elk because that visual stimuli is more salient. So what's important to understand is the dog will only learn about a stimuli if he perceives it and if he pays attention to it. If the dog doesn't perceive to the squirrel, he's not going to learn about that stimuli. If the dog doesn't respond to a loud noise, he's not going to perceive it and he's not going to learn about it. So what we need to do is be very smart and clever and strategic in the use of our different stimuli. What goes hand in hand with this is overshadowing. And basically what overshadowing means is that a lesser salient stimuli will be overshadowed by a more salient stimuli, like the dry kibble with the fresh liver and the quiet audible cue with the loud noise. The loud noise is overshadowing the big noise. So again, here it is touch, smell, visual, and audible. So again, when going through the training field, let's be aware of the order of stimuli and what they can do to help us in our training and how they can prevent some excellence in performance. Example, you have trained Fido to sit when a bell rings. Now you also want your dog to sit on the command sit. So you say sit simultaneously with the sound of the bell. After dog has heard the word sit 100 times, you remove the bell and try the command alone. Your dog will not sit. Why? In the blocking effect, the conditioning of an association between two stimuli, a conditioned stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus, is impaired in the conditioning process. That effect takes place if a new conditioned stimulus is presented together with an already conditioned stimulus to that unconditioned stimuli. Let's look at Pavlov's research. Pavlov's research basically paired a bell, the conditioned stimulus bell, to the unconditioned stimulus food. So when the bell went up, the dog responded by salivating. Now what we want to do is we want to try to make the dog have that same salivating response to a new conditioned stimulus, light. We're going to switch on a bright light. So what we're going to do is we're going to pair the new conditioned stimulus light to the previous conditioned stimulus bell to the food, to the unconditioned stimulus. What will happen is when we remove the bell and we try the light, is the dog will actually not have that same salivating response. And the reason why is because that new conditioning, the association of that new conditioning from the light to the unconditioned stimulus food has not taken place and has been blocked by the previous conditioned stimulus, the sound. And that, my friends, is blocking. One of my favorite topics. Other things that influence learning is stress. Dr. Walter Cannon, an American doctor in the early 1900s, he researched the homeostatic response of animals to threats and dangers. What he did is, hey, I see that the homeostatic response changes. And what is homeostasis? It's basically our body's ability to maintain a right pH. And so what he saw that in a fight, flight, avoidance response, that homeostatic balance was changing. And so one of the things that were happening is that the dog would get stress hormones. The way the body responses is they have dilated pupils. Their digestive system can either be, enhanced or so they can get diarrhea or they get constipated. But you will see a dog changing. So, for instance, like you see that with a lot of high drive dogs that are constantly go 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 go. So their body is basically always under stress. So stress doesn't mean something negative. Stress doesn't always mean scared. Like when you're doing a marathon, your body is in stress. When you're swimming or you're cold, your body is in stress. So these working dogs, these protection dogs, those tracking dogs, their body is in stress. Blood pressure to the muscle, the blood pressure changes, the release of certain hormones like adrenaline and cortisol, bladder control. So sometimes because of stress, like look at dogs that are put in a crate on an airplane. Some of these dogs, they have 25 to 38-hour flights and they don't even pee. It's because of the body's response to that form of stress. And they said, okay, I'm going to shut down these functions, etc., etc. When the dog is in stress, it really affects learning. Basically, when cortisol is present, then the dog's ability to learn is not there anymore. So cortisol is a stress hormone, and it's very, very important to understand the effects of cortisol in the body and what it does with the dog's ability to learn and to recover. In humans, so when we get stressed in a situation, maybe we're almost in a car crash and you got your dog in the back of the car and you almost got hit by a car and your heart is racing and you made it to the side of the road. Your dog shook and thrown around in a crate in the back of the car. You get out of the car, you call your best friends, and literally within 45 minutes to about 90 minutes, you will actually be a lot calmer. Yeah. In the beginning, you might have sweaty hands. You might have rapid breathing. You might get a little bit of tunnel vision. But after about an hour, you are going to start to feel better. And that's because of the half-life of cortisol in humans is between 60 and 120 minutes. So if your cortisol spikes, like a half-life of 60 minutes means that after 60 minutes, there's only half of that cortisol left in your body. With dogs, however, that's around 300 minutes. Yeah, so that's 5 hours, guys. So if a dog gets in a stressful situation, it takes at least 5 hours for that dog to calm down for about half. So can you imagine, like, I have these days here where my neighbors are shooting. We have a weekend of very very heavy protection training, so my dogs are constantly in this very high level of stress. That's the reason why on a Monday I am completely closed. Nobody comes after the weekends because my neighbors are normally working and my club is gone. There's nobody here, even Charlie isn't here, and my dogs can actually de-stress. So that's the reason why I do this, because it takes about 5 hours for that cortisol to go. So on Mondays, they have a really easy day. We play a little bit, we do some fun stuff because dopamine, helps reduce the half-life of cortisol. But yeah, that's what I do. We need to be very, very careful in when we train because again, when cortisol levels are high, then that really affects the ability of learning. Let's look at this stacking here. See this red line? That is a threshold, and that threshold means that the dog is going to show external signs of stress. A threshold is always the same. Once you're born, when an animal is born, it's having this threshold, how much stress that he can endure, and then when he goes over it, then he's showing physical signs of stress. A lot of trainers think the threshold can be changed, we can go up and down, which is not the case. That threshold always stays the same. What we can do is eventually by habituation and counter conditioning is that the dog's response to a certain stimuli that normally causes stress, that the body is going to start producing less and less amounts of cortisol, and hence the people think that they raised the threshold, but they haven't. They just reduced the amount of cortisol that's produced by a particular stimuli. What happens is when we have certain stimuli, for instance, gunshots and loud noises and visual stimuli, and they all cause some stress. We have something that I call cortisol stacking. So they're basically stress clusters. So if you look at this chart, we see all these different colors, and every color represents a different trigger. So, for instance, blue might be a gunshot, and then that creates a trigger, and eventually that will every 5 hours it's about half. Then green might be a lawnmower or whatever stimuli it is to get stressed, and eventually the dog with if he faces the red trigger, he goes over threshold and starts showing signs of stress. And so I hear a lot of my clients say that, hey, my dog's always been good with escalators or always been good with elevators, and then out of the blue he started panicking at a particular elevator. It's often not that particular elevator. What happens is there were antecedents of other stimuli that caused cortisol, and eventually that stressor that normally doesn't produce visual signs of stress now did because of the cortisol stacking. And my doggy never did that before. He saw this guy, and now he started growling in the city, for instance. Well, because he might be stressed by the cars and by catwalks and whatever it is, and then this one particular guy produces only a little bit of stress, and there he was, goes over thresholds. What did we learn? We learned a lot. We learned how animals learn. We took a deep dive into Skinner's operant conditioning theory. We looked at factors that affect learning. We looked at stress. We looked at reinforcement. We looked at reinforcement schedules. And we took a deep dive into stimuli. I hope this video helped you in your pathway to become a better trainer. I hope this video increased your knowledge about animal behavior and behavior analysis. I want to thank you in purchasing this video and be a part of our dog training community. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.